Yes, so. Yes, and far away. Yes, yes.
This looks like
How do you pronounce that? Torque. That's because when I was reading, I'm like,
right. He's the guy
I
that
give
yeah.
up. I told Cheryl, I
On
was
a
like,
couple
I'm
of occasions,
not
he's the guy that wrote that thing about how the CEO could, how you could use the change. I was wondering if he was happy. Yeah, that's what this looks like.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. They've got all the testimonies over there on that table. Yeah. And a couple of them, that we haven't had before.
A lot of these rooms are this size or smaller. 'Cause I used to work around the corner, and the room was about a little bit smaller.
Good answer. Very powerful.
The other side with the high ceilings and the ornate woodwork. No, most of them are. Some of them don't even have a.
Back there. Yeah, I got this funny career arc, different inflections.
Rob called me yesterday and he said, just want to let you know that we're probably talking about small sample bias. And I said, oh, God, no. not that we're afraid of it. It was just like, oh, these guys are just going to be like, what? But the White House is so
This is, if Ralph is right, it's a very striking fact that we're talking about this thing for more than a decade, and the majority of the effect is actually something different than what we've been talking about.
yeah.
Even if they can't bring themselves to say change CPI in the economic precedent, we're interested.
So what is your role at CBO? You're over the economic studies or something like that, or?
So there's several of us in the director's office. So Sandy is legislative affairs, and Doug and Bob are the director, the deputy director, and the other person in the director's office. So
Oh, okay.
we just give some oversight to all.
I see. I see.
Eric, are you all moved into Washington D.C. or are you commuting?
Commuting, but somehow I rented a small apartment above the Harris Teeter.
Testing, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
10-minute walk to the bureau. The weekends, my husband and I take the It's only been 3 months. I think we probably go to New York more than he comes down here, but I'm not sure exactly what the ratio will be.
Actually, no, I could test drive on,
Going back this way.
not quite as much
3
attention
weekends in a row.
and hot of an issue.
That
Oh, is that
many
right?
times in a row.
Now, you find that Amtrak is good in terms of like wireless and stuff like that, or is it just more that it's reading time?
I'm not using the wireless that much, I find. But I think my main complaint with Amtrak is I wish it was so expensive.
Oh, I know, I know.
Other than that, I'm okay with it.
Okay. Okay. Press.
Good morning. Thank y'all for being here. This is the first in the committee's hearing series on the president's and other bipartisan entitlement reform proposals. You know, we need to protect and preserve Social Security, and that's what this committee is all about. According to the Social Security Board of Trustees, beginning in 2033, Social Security will be unable to pay full benefits. In other words, when today's 47-year-old workers reach their full retirement age in 2033, and everyone else already is receiving benefits, face a 25% benefit cut unless Congress reforms Social Security, which we can do. The inclusion of using a more accurate measure of inflation in President Obama's budget is a welcome acknowledgement that we must take action to make sure that Social Security is there for future generations. The purpose of this hearing is to have a full discussion of a policy with wide bipartisan support, more accurately measuring inflation in order to fix the Social Security system. Congress passed the first benefit increase in 1950, later increased benefits 10 other times before passing a law in 1972 that created a formula to determine the cost of living adjustments, or COLAs. The Social Security COLA increases benefits each year that there's inflation. If there's no inflation, there aren't any COLAs, as was the case in 2009 and 2010. But if prices fall, benefits cannot be reduced. At the time automatic COLAs were enacted, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, only produced one measure of inflation, which remains the inflation measure used to determine Social Security COLAs today. However, BLS has since developed other measures, including the Chain Consumer Price Index, or Chain CPI, which we will discuss today. The president's own budget says most economists agree that the Chain CPI provides more accurate measure of the average change to the cost of living than the standard CPI. In testifying before the full Ways and Means Committee last week, Treasury Secretary Jack Lew stated the Chain CPI is a more accurate measure of inflation in that it does a better job of reflecting the substitution of goods in response to relative price changes. Today we will hear from the Commissioner of BLS why that is. Some say using the Chain CPI to measure inflation would result in a benefit cut, but that's plainly false. The truth is that benefits will continue to grow, only more slowly than under the current, less accurate measure. Only in Washington would that be called a benefit cut. That said, I fully recognize and am sensitive to the impact this change could have on some beneficiaries' pocketbooks, especially those who receive benefits for a long time. But the fact of the matter is the current measure overstates inflation and ignores that it is simply unfair to our children and grandchildren who rightly expect us to make sure that Social Security will be there for them. Let me be clear. Determining the adequacy of Social Security benefits, especially for those who are most vulnerable, is an important discussion to have. And we will, as part of this hearing series on a bipartisan entitlement reforms. The president likes to say that if we agree on a policy, then we ought to act and not let our differences hold us up. We owe it to every American to carry out our responsibility and carefully examine each bipartisan policy option, and we will through this hearing series. Mr. Becerra's not here, and so I'm gonna ask without objection, all written testimony will be made part of the record. We have one witness panel today. Seated at the table are Erica Groshin, Commissioner, accompanied by Michael Hargan, Associate Commissioner, Office of Price and Living Condition, Bureau of Labor Statistics, Department of Labor. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Jeffrey Kling, Associate Director for Economic Analysis, Congressional Budget Office. Ed Lorenzen, Executive Director of the Moment of Truth Project, Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Nancy Altman, Co-Chair, Strengthen Social Security Coalition. And Charles Blayhouse, Public Trustee, Social Security and Medicare Board of Trustees, whom we have frequently, and thank you for being here. Welcome. Thanks to all of you for being here. Commissioner Grossen, will you go ahead with your testimony?
Good morning. I thank the subcommittee for this opportunity to talk about the family of consumer price indexes published by the BLS. As you know, we produce some of the nation's most current and important economic statistics, including the inflation measures under discussion today. And in doing so, we help policymakers, businesses, and households to make the best decisions for themselves and others. I'll start by describing the CPI-U. The measurement objective of all of our CPIs is to estimate changes over time in the cost to consumers of maintaining the same standard of living. So how do we construct the CPI-U? We estimate the change in prices that consumers pay for a market basket of goods and services in urban areas. This market basket is divided into item categories, such as uncooked beef steaks. We collect prices for goods across 211 item categories in 87 urban areas, resulting in over 8,000 unique item area cells. And we collect expenditure weights for each of these cells, such as steak in Chicago. The weights represent shares of total consumer expenditures across all items and areas. The data source for the weights is our Consumer Expenditure Survey. With prices and weights in hand, we produce the CPI in 2 stages, and understanding these stages is the key to understanding how our indexes differ. In stage 1, we calculate a CPI-U for each cell. That's the average change in prices. And for most cells, we use a formula that assumes that consumers actually do substitute among products within the cell. In stage 2, we combine our indexes across all the cells to produce a national number. And the CPI-U uses a formula that assumes consumers don't substitute across items or areas. That is, we assume they don't adjust their purchases between steak and chicken in Chicago as prices change. So what is the CPI-W? It aims to estimate price changes for households that receive more than half of their income from wage and clerical jobs. The formulas and the prices that we use in the CPI-W are the same as for the CPI-U. The only difference is that the CPI-W uses consumer expenditure weights that are based on the wage and clerical group. So what about the experimental CPI-E? Again, we use the same formulas and the same prices as the CPI-U, but we use expenditure weights for households with a respondent or spouse aged 62 or older. Over the past 20 years, while the CPI-U and the CPI-W increased at an average annual rate of 2.4%, the CPI-E rate was 2.6%. This reflects only differences in expenditure patterns of these populations. For example, older Americans' relatively heavy spending on health care. We call the CPI-E experimental, partly because the expenditure weights are based on smaller sample sizes. But also, our CPI-U sample may not represent well where the elderly shop, where they live, what they buy, and the prices they pay. Moving to an official CPI-E would require a thorough research effort. So now, finally, what about the chained CPI-U? This differs from the indexes that I just talked about in weights and formulas. Furthermore, we revise it twice before it's final. Stage 1 is the same. Stage 2 uses a superlative index formula that captures how consumers actually adjust what they buy as relative prices change. Because consumers make such adjustments, the growth in the chained CPIU is typically smaller than that for the regular CPIU. For the past 12 years, ending in December 2011, while the CPIU grew at an average annual rate of 2.5%, the chained CPIU rate was 2.2%. The other difference is that there are lags in reporting the chained CPIU. It takes a long time to collect consumer expenditure shares and to estimate their weights. The final chained CPIU for March 2013 will be published in February 2015. So to sum up, as part of our continuing efforts to improve measurements in our dynamic economy, the BLS has created a chained CPIU to gauge the cost of living in a way that accounts for how consumers substitute among goods when price changes are not uniform. I thank you for the opportunity to testify before this committee. Dr. Horrigan and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. That's insightful. Mr. Becerra,
Chairman?
do you still want to make your opening remarks?
Sure, I can wait till everyone testifies, or I can do it right now.
Well, we'll delay the rest of you for a moment and let Mr. Becerra make his opening remarks. Go ahead, you're recognized.
Appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize to the witnesses that I had to run a little late. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to the rest of your testimony. I want to just begin by making a quick observation. At a time when folks are talking about their economic security, this is perhaps the most important time to make sure we maintain social security, because it is for many Americans, not just seniors, but to many disabled Americans, working Americans who become disabled, and to children, to widows and widowers. It is their economic security. Anytime someone says to you Social Security is broke or bankrupt or causing our deficit, I will say emphatically here, that's contrary to the evidence. In fact, I think I'd be on very safe ground to say anyone who says that Social Security is broke or bankrupt is lying, because the facts show just the opposite. And let's look at the numbers. And I would say to anyone who wants to contest what I'm about to tell you, show me your numbers. I'll show you some numbers, and you can see them on this chart. Social Security currently has about a $2.7 trillion surplus. And that's because over its more than 77 years of taking in taxes from Americans who've been working and paying into Social Security, it has brought in tax contributions over $14.5 trillion. It has also earned on those trillions that have been invested into the trust fund by tax-paying Americans about $1.5 trillion. At the same time, it has only had to spend in benefits and a very tiny sliver that you see above that red bar in administrative costs, because administrative costs are less than 1%, a total spending of $13.5 trillion. And so the math is very simple. More than $2.5 trillion that Americans have contributed to Social Security through their taxes that have never been used. Through 13 recessions, in more than 77 years, Social Security has never failed once to pay benefits on time and in full. And so when we discuss Social Security, we should discuss it in that context of the reality and the truth of what Social Security is. And so when you hear conversations about what should happen to Social Security and to those earned benefits that Americans have paid into the system so they could get them when they retire, or should they become disabled, or should they happen to die, so that their spouse, who's now a widow or widower, or their children, who are now the children of a deceased parent, have a chance to survive, those are the folks that we should concern ourselves most with. Switching to the chained CPI, the so-called adjustment, a change to the way we calculate the cost of living, the COLA increase that seniors, disabled folks, survivors of an American who has perished get, is nothing more than a cut to the benefits that people receive. The paycheck or the earned check that people receive from Social Security will decrease. It is a cut. And it is a substantial cut, because we know the power of compound interest. With time, that cut grows in size. And so if we're talking about economic security at this time when our economy is beginning to recover from those devastations of the 2008 Wall Street crisis, you would think that we would want to provide people with the greatest economic security, and that would be through their Social Security earned benefits. The chain CPI affects not just seniors or disabled or children or widows. It affects veterans who will see their benefits that they have earned cut. It affects any number of folks, including middle income and low income tax-paying families who will see their taxes rise. And so the chain CPI is coming at the worst time for all those folks who worked very hard and thought they had paid into a system on a bargain, that it would be there for them because they paid into it. Let us remember that a typical American middle-income worker at the age of 65 under the chain CPI would lose about $140 of his or her annual benefit if chain CPI were to become the law. But by age 75, the annual benefit would be cut by $560. And by the time he or she reaches age 85, the age at which most seniors tend to depend most on Social Security, the annual benefit would be cut almost $1,000 a year. So the problem here is that we have to know our facts, and we have to recognize that economic security is perhaps the most important thing for our parents, our grandparents, our children, disabled families, and certainly for American working families. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm looking forward to hearing the testimony because there is nothing more important than the security of Social Security. With that, I'll yield back.
Yeah. Well, you guys need to take what he said with a grain of salt. Some of that's shading the truth.
Show me the numbers.
Easily. We're not going to quit paying Social Security, let's face it. Mr. Kling, welcome aboard. Please proceed.
Thanks for inviting me to testify. As you know, the Social Security Administration increases recipients' monthly benefits in most years. For example, the 1.7% COLA that applied to benefits paid in January 2013 was based on the increase in a consumer price index between 2011 and 2012. One option for lawmakers would be to link to another measure of inflation, the chain CPI. That index generally grows more slowly than the traditional CPI does, an average of about 1/4 of a percentage point more slowly per year over the past decade. Using the chain CPI in a variety of federal programs and the tax code would reduce the deficit by a total of $340 billion over the next 10 years if implemented starting in calendar year 2014, according to estimates by the Congressional Budget Office and the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation. The President's budget for fiscal year 2014 includes a related but less comprehensive option that would use the chain CPI for Social Security and some other spending programs as well as for the tax system. CBO is currently reviewing that and other proposals in the President's budget, but I will not be discussing those specific proposals today. In my remarks this morning, I'll focus on the part of CBO's analysis examining a generic proposal to use the chain CPI for indexing COLAs in Social Security starting next year. Such a policy would not alter the size of people's benefits when they are first eligible, either now or in the future, but it would reduce their benefits in subsequent years because of the reduction in the average COLA relative to current law. The impact would be greater the longer people receive benefits, that is, the more reduced COLAs they experienced. For example, after a year, the Social Security benefits paid to a 63-year-old who had claimed initial retirement benefits at age 62 would be about 1/4% lower on average if the chain CPI was used for indexing. After 10 years of COLAs, the effect for a 73-year-old would be 2.5% on average. After 30 years of COLAs, the effect for a 93-year-old would be 7.2% on average. According to CBO's analysis, using the chain CPI for annual COLAs would reduce outlays for Social Security relative to CBO's current law baseline by $1.6 billion in 2014. Those savings would grow each year, reaching $24.8 billion in 2023, and would total $127 billion over the 2014 to 2023 period. CBO projects that Social Security recipients would face an average benefit reduction of about $3 per person per month in 2014 and roughly $30 per person per month in 2023. By 2033, outlays for Social Security would be 3% lower than they would be under current law, or 6% of gross domestic product rather than 6.2%. As a result, the gap between Social Security's outlays and tax revenues in that year would shrink by about 1/6 to 1% of GDP. According to many analysts, the traditional CPI overstates increases in the cost of living because it does not fully account for the fact that consumers generally adjust their spending patterns as some prices change relative to other prices, and because of a statistical bias related to the limited amount of price data that the BLS can collect. However, using the chain CPI instead for indexing Social Security could have disadvantages. The values of that index are revised over a period of years, so the programs would have to be indexed to a preliminary estimate of the chain CPI that is subject to estimation error. Also, the chain CPI may understate the growth in the cost of living for some groups. For instance, some evidence indicates that the cost of living grows at a faster rate for the elderly than for younger people, in part because of changes in healthcare prices, which play a disproportionate role in older people's cost of living. However, determining the impact of rising healthcare prices on the cost of someone's standard of living is problematic because it is difficult to measure the prices that individuals actually pay and to accurately account for changes in the quality of healthcare. Changing the measure of inflation used for indexing is only one of many possible modifications to Social Security. If the Congress wishes to slow the growth of federal spending by constraining outlays for Social Security benefits or to improve the long-term solvency of the program by making changes to its spending or revenues, many other approaches are possible, a number of which CBO has analyzed previously. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Lorenzen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Becerra, and members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to be before you and an unusual experience to be on this side of the table. I am Executive Director of the Moment of Truth Project, which was established to continue on the work of the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, also known as the Bowles-Simpson Commission. And I worked on the staff of the Fiscal Commission. On a personal note, I'd like to briefly note that I have had significant personal experience with the value of the Social Security program, having received survivor's benefits as a child after the death of my father, and more recently having had to manage my family's finances for a period based on Social Security benefits. But neither of those experiences have convinced me that providing COLAs that are greater than the rate of inflation is the desirable right policy, rather that we should try to find a way to make the Social Security system fiscally strong by making progressive changes in the benefits in a way that strengthens poverty protections for the programs. The CPI offers a rare opportunity to achieve both significant savings spread across the entire budget by making a technical improvement to existing policies. Briefly, just brief background, the issue of overstatement of inflation and CPI gained prominence in 1995 when then Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan mentioned the issue and his belief in testimony before Congress. But even before Chairman Greenspan's comments, the Congressional Budget Office had done a report noting that there was a growing discussion and debate among economists identifying a bias in CPI. In response to Chairman Greenspan's comments, the Senate Finance Committee, chaired by then Senator Pat Moynihan, appointed the Boskin Commission, which did a review of CPI and estimated a bias of between 0.7 and 2.0%. While there was controversy over many of the specific elements and disagreements of the specific findings, the general consensus and findings were broadly accepted and confirmed by subsequent analysis by the Federal Reserve Board and others. In response to that discussion, the Bureau of Labor Statistics did a thorough review of the methodology and made changes where I felt there were improvements that could be made, including the introduction of the geometric mean to deal with lower substitution bias and other changes. Those changes reduced the bias by 0.35% and were implemented with very little notice or controversy, which, and by coincidence, are very similar to what switching to chain CPI would do. The changes that BLS was able to do administratively did not address the issue of upper-level substitution bias, which is what chain CPI is intended to do, as described before. On the Fiscal Commission, when we started meeting with various groups for suggestions about ideas for deficit reduction, switching to the chain CPI for all parts of the budget was one of the common themes of suggestions from groups across the ideological perspective. And in the Commission meetings, it was an area of early discussion for potential consensus among members. There was a definite agreement that it should only be done as a technical correction and therefore should be applied to all parts of the budget equally. Interestingly, it was a Democratic member of the Commission who first raised the idea of chain CPI for Social Security, and a Republican member who raised it on the issue of revenues, but both did so on the basis that it should be done for accuracy. The final Commission report did include a switch to chain CPI, and had some low-income protections. It was one of the few elements that every member of the Commission who voted for the plan did support. Since the commission report has come out, there have been additional recommendations for improvements for low-income protections which should be considered. Switching to the chain CPI has broad support from economists across the spectrum, which I've detailed in my testimony, and it's been included in every major bipartisan proposal. The budgetary effects have just been described. I would just note that while most of the focus has been on the impact it would have on Social Security would represent slightly more than a third of the savings, while the remaining 2/3 of savings would come from revenues and changes in other government programs. Switching to chain CPI would also close approximately 1/5 of the Social Security funding gap and help avoid the trust fund exhaustion and therefore avoid the automatic reduction in benefits that would occur with trust fund exhaustion. It's important to remember that under chain CPI, nominal benefits would continue to increase. We estimate they would increase by approximately 60% over 20 years under chain CPI instead of a 68% increase under the current measure. And also, interestingly, real benefits for an 85-year-old will be higher in the future than they are for a similar retiree today. If you were to compare a worker who retired at age 65 and who is 85 and is 85 today, and then took a worker who retired today at age 65 and received benefits and was subject to chain CPI, that future retiree would still have a higher benefit in real inflation-adjusted terms by about 8% higher. On the distributional effects, both the Tax Policy Center and Social Security Administration have found that switching to chain CPI is roughly distributionally neutral. However, that does not mean we should not have concerns about the distributional effects. However, those should be addressed in the context, ideally, of a comprehensive plan where it makes comprehensive reforms of Social Security program and tax system to make the tax code and Social Security system more progressive. But absent that, there are many proposals where you could make much more targeted, much more effective improvements to provide benefits for lower income beneficiaries who have been assisted by the higher chain CPI, which provides a very blunt and poorly targeted way to provide assistance to those populations. I just very briefly touch on...
The gentleman's time has expired. Would you try to close it now?
Okay, I'll just very briefly touch this, and hopefully this will come from questions and answers. Moving to the CPIE would be a very controversial step. There are many questions and concerns about the methodology of CPIE, and that I can get into further in my testimony. But I would just conclude by saying that any changes in deficit reduction are going to require tough choices. But moving to chain CPI is not a change in policy, but rather a more accurate way to implement the current policy, and any adverse effects of implementing current policy more accurately should be addressed by more targeted and effective policies.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Altman, you're recognized.
Thank you. As you know, every January, Social Security benefits are automatically adjusted for inflation. Some refer to these adjustments as increases, but they're not. They're intended to allow those on fixed incomes to remain in place, to simply tread water. Without accurate and timely inflation adjustments, retirees, people with serious and permanent disabilities, and others will see their Social Security erode as they age. That's no small matter. Half of retirees have total incomes, that's incomes from all sources, of less than $17,000. Most of that comes from Social Security. 1 out of 3 seniors relies on Social Security for virtually all of their income. Nearly 1 out of 2 seniors age 80 or over does. And for women and people of color, the reliance is even greater. The intent of the adjustment is to allow beneficiaries to tread water, but they're not. They're sinking. The current inflation index under-measures the inflation they experience. The index is designed for workers and the general public, but seniors and people with disabilities spend more on health care, where prices rise faster, and less on clothing, recreation, and other items where prices tend to rise slower. Chain weighting an index that already under-measures their inflation simply will sink beneficiaries faster. By shielding some from the harshest impacts of the chain CPI, the Simpson-Bowles, Rivlin-Domenici, and administration proposals all implicitly concede that it is less accurate for this population. People don't need to be shielded from a more accurate adjustment. But these protections cannot solve what is a poorly targeted benefit cut. The chain CPI cuts the benefits of every single one of today's 57 million beneficiaries. But people already on fixed incomes have little or no ability to make up the loss. In addition, the cost grows with each succeeding year like a snowball rolling down a hill, hitting hardest the oldest of the old, the poor, and the near poor. Members must confront many divisive issues, but Social Security is not one of them. Poll after poll reveals that Democrats, independents, Republicans, union households, Tea Partiers, the young, the old, and virtually every other demographic overwhelmingly agree about Social Security. They agree that Social Security should not be addressed as part of a deficit deal to reduce the deficit, and they're right. Cutting Social Security does not reduce by even a penny the federal government's total debt burden. Cutting it does not buy the government a single extra day of borrowing authority. Let me repeat, because many people find this surprising. Cutting Social Security does not reduce at all the federal government's debt subject to the debt limit. Including Social Security in a deficit package gives the appearance that policymakers are raiding Social Security's contributions and diverting them to unauthorized purposes. You can easily avoid this improper appearance by addressing Social Security as it should be addressed, on its own and in the sunshine. That was how it was done in 1977 and 1983, when Social Security's projected shortfall was much more immediate. In 1983, it was 6 months versus 20 years today, and much larger, over 8% of taxable payroll in 1977 versus less than 3% today. Social Security is too complicated and too important to address any other way. But to do that, policymakers have to be prepared to follow the will of the people. This body must open the door to more than just a narrow group of budget experts. An open process focused solely on Social Security will not lead to the chain CPI. Instead, it will lead, I am confident, to a stronger foundation of economic security for America's workers and their families. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Blahouse. Welcome again. Good to see you. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, all the members of the subcommittee. It's an honor, as always, to appear before you. Today, as has been mentioned, I'm here to discuss proposals to apply the chain CPI to the calculation of Social Security COLAs. In my written testimony, I've provided some background information about how the COLAs are currently calculated, along with some basic information about the current state of program finances. Because my speaking time is limited, what I'd like to do is gloss over most of that background information and really just focus on three major points. The first point, admittedly at the risk of stating the obvious, is that whether chain CPI should be used for Social Security COLAs is primarily a function of whether you as lawmakers are persuaded that it's technically meritorious as a measure of general price inflation. Obviously, if you weren't so persuaded, it wouldn't make sense to apply it to Social Security. If you were persuaded, I would argue that it should be applied to Social Security along with everything else, including the Federal Income Tax Code, including other federal programs. I would not recommend specifically singling out Social Security for the change, nor would I recommend specifically exempting it. Second point has to do with the state of program finances and the impact of chain CPI upon them. Basically, the current Social Security system faces a substantial financing shortfall that consists of a significant excess of scheduled benefits over projected taxes. And one way or the other, we're going to need legislation to correct that. Our best estimates are that if chained CPI were adopted, it would reduce that shortfall by between 16 and 20%, depending on the measure that is employed to measure it. Now, that would be a significant financial step in the right direction, although one could argue it's modest in the context of the overall financing shortfall. A very important factor to bear in mind is that with each passing year, the shortfall has been growing larger. And because of that, changes to change CPI that improve the financing situation would actually get us back a little bit less than to where we were 2 years ago. It would make up not fully for the last 2 years of deterioration in program finances. So we'd still have a very long way to go. I would regard CPI reform as sort of a broader government-wide technical reform in how inflation is measured. I wouldn't regard it as Social Security reform or entitlement reform or tax reform. The basic work of comprehensive solvency reform would still be ahead of us. The final recommendation I have, and this is a subjective one, but I believe it very strongly, which is that if, regardless of what the subcommittee concludes with respect to the technical merits of change CPI, I would recommend that we continue to base Social Security COLAs on measures of general price inflation affecting America as a whole and population as a whole. Occasionally you read commentary from people suggesting that we should have a sort of a senior-specific inflation index and use that for Social Security COLAs. I would strongly recommend against doing that. That approach, I think, would suffer from a number of disqualifying problems. One is that you have to remember a lot of Social Security recipients are not elderly. A lot are dependent children. You have the disabled. 19% are disabled and their dependents. Clearly, it would be inappropriate to use an inflation index for the elderly to index benefits for children or young disabled. And so if you went down the road of trying to have specific inflation indices for specific subpopulations in Social Security, we could create real problems and real chaos in a hurry. We'd have a situation where different components of the Social Security population would be getting different COLAs, and that could be very divisive. You have to also remember that people move from one group to the other. When the disabled reach retirement age, they convert from disability to retirement benefits. And it wouldn't take very long for people to notice that there are other disparities in inflation experienced by other subpopulations, geographic differences, things like that. So I would strongly caution against going down the road of trying to divvy up the Social Security recipient population into subpopulations. I would recommend sticking with the long-standing use of CPI, which is the measure for general price inflation affecting the population as a whole. So in conclusion, Mr. Chairman, I would just say again, I think the main point is that whether it should be applied for Social Security COLAs is really a function of the technical merits of change CPI as a measure of general price inflation. It would have a positive but modest effect upon program finances, and we would still have in front of us the major work of Social Security financing reforms. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. As is customary for each round of questions, I'm going to limit my time to 5 minutes and ask my colleagues to also limit their questioning time to 5 minutes as well. Commissioner Goshen, it seems like we have an acronym for everything here in Washington. Maybe we could think up a new one today. For those not so well versed in inside the Beltway jargon, what exactly is the CPI? And is it best called an inflation estimator? And how does your staff go about determining it?
Well, as I said, we think of it as a way to estimate the changes over time in the cost to consumers of maintaining their standard of living. So it really focuses on what it is that consumers buy and weights it by the experience of consumers. So it's an attempt to measure a cost of living index. And in that way, the change CPI is different from the CPI that we had before because it allows for substitution. So when people can substitute for goods, they experience less of a decline in their standard of living than when they can't substitute among goods. And therefore, the cost to restore them to their previous standard of living is lower. It also corrects another technical problem called the small sample bias that I can tell you more about if you're interested.
Well, how is chained CPI different? I haven't really said that. And what does it mean to call a CPI chained?
Well, one of the benefits of having it be chained is that you can compare the current level of the index to an original level very simply. So that's where the term chained comes from. So that's again a somewhat technical explanation, but it's really on the this difference between the current one. You have to do a more complicated set of algebra to be able to get the total difference over time.
Do we have to go back to college?
No, you might need to use your calculator, that's all.
Why is chain considered the most accurate measure of inflation?
It's considered more accurate because it allows for this substitution where consumers substitute. So it doesn't act as if consumers are more constrained than they actually are.
Dr. Blyhouse, you're well-versed in Social Security history, have been here many times. Wasn't the original reason for the COLA to ensure benefits keep pace with inflation? And if the current measure is not accurate, don't we need to switch to a more accurate one?
Well, I would argue yes, and that was the original intent. The COLAs were basically created in the 1972 Social Security amendments, which have kind of a torturous history. There were some mistakes that were made in the 72 amendments, and also the way it's done today really reflects the state of knowledge at the time. Basically, they made an effort to adjust benefits for inflation, both for people already receiving them and for initial retirees, and they made some technical errors in the application to new retirees, and that's what the whole 1977 amendment set of changes was about, and the notch babies and that whole story. So they made some mistakes. The reason we are using CPI-W today for Social Security is not so much because people regard it as the most accurate measure of inflation. It was just the only one that was around at the time. Even CPI-U wasn't around at the time of the 72 amendments. And so over time, the interpretation has been that CPI-W is the one that has to be applied to Social Security COLAs based on the old wording of the law.
Mr. Chairman, if I can just add to that.
No, ma'am. I'm not asking you the question.
Okay.
Thank you. And my time's practically expired, so I'm going to stop now. Mr. Becerra, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think it's appropriate to talk about this chain CPI. I think it's a very appropriate name for this change in the way you calculate seniors' benefits. It really does drag down the ability of those who rely on Social Security to know that their Social Security will be there for them the way they expected. They will be chained down. On the issue, Ms. Grosjean, of the accuracy of the chain CPI or the CPI, you also do a calculation called the CPIE, which is a calculation of the cost of living for the elderly. And you take a sample of elderly Americans throughout the country. It's a smaller sample, and you don't apply it, but you keep a study that samples elderly Americans when it comes to what their cost of living is. In that CPIE, which calculates cost of living for elderly, do you notice a difference between the CPIE and the currently used CPI?
Yes, we do. The difference between the two measures, the CPIE and the CPIU, are the weights, the consumption weights, differences between the elderly and the non-elderly.
What are the actual results? Because I know I'm going to run out of time. Which ends up providing a higher benefit amount to an elderly person? The currently used CPIU or the CPIE, which takes into account the survey of elderly folks?
So during the period from December 82 to December 2012, the average annualized change for the CPI-W was 2.8%, and for the CPIE it was 3.1%. So it was 0.3% higher for the CPIE.
Okay, so the CPIE, which is a calculation of the cost of living for elderly that you do, showed that the elderly have a cost of living that's higher than the average consumer that you use to calculate the regular consumer price index. And now we have the change CPI, which would be below the currently used CPI down here. And so when people ask, is this a more accurate measure of what the costs of a senior are, there's a good chance that that senior is going to lose way more than what he or she is currently receiving, which may already be inaccurate given that seniors probably tend to use health care more than the average consumer that you use to measure your CPI. I suspect, I'm guessing Mr. Kling and Mr. Lorenzen are probably the youngest folks here. I suspect they haven't had to worry about colonoscopies yet. They probably, as being male, don't worry about mammograms as much. But once you're a senior, that colonoscopy is something you have to regularly do. And if you're female, you probably have to worry about mammograms quite a bit. Now, if you're young and healthy, you don't have to worry about that. You might decide if you're running out of money, you won't buy the steak, you'll buy the chicken because it's less expensive, but I doubt you're going to have a choice when it comes to a colonoscopy of getting a colonoscopy or a cheaper colonoscopy somewhere else, or of taking your heart medication or buying a cheaper heart medication. So it is a less flexible calculation for seniors when it comes to their ability to substitute one product or one service for another, because for them, we'd love to have as many choices in healthcare, for example, as possible, but they're not always there. Ms. Altman, does the change to a change CPI, as modest as it may sound when we speak of it in terms of accountants and these 0.0 this or 0.0 that, does it have an actual impact on the resources that most seniors or disabled or survivors of our deceased American workers have?
Absolutely. It has, as I say, it has a snowballing effect. And so it compounds over time. The longer, the older you get, the larger the cut. And so we've calculated that for someone who, average worker, retires at age 65, lives, fortunate enough to live 30 years, even with these bump ups in these various proposals, would still lose a cumulative amount of about $15,000. And that's someone who during his working years was only earning $40,000.
So it's a hit. Well, let me just conclude by saying, well, I thank you all for your testimony. We have to continue to examine these things. I think Mr. Blauhaus said it correctly. We have to hear in Congress decide what we do. And I would simply finally add that knowing that Social Security has never added a single penny to our deficits, I would hope that we can confine our discussions about working on strengthening Social Security to Social Security, not within the context of budget deficits that Social Security never caused. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Renacci, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses today for being here. You know, when I saw this chart in the beginning, it's interesting because you try and learn some things, but I wanted to ask you, Mr. Kling, if this statement is true. Since 2010, Social Security has been paying more in benefits than it receives in revenue, and that the cash flow deficit for the 10-year period ending 2023 is projected to reach $1.3 trillion, according to the CBO.
Yes, that is correct. The Congressional Budget Office generally focuses on the budget of the government as a whole, and on that basis, the dedicated revenue from Social Security taxes was less than outlays for Social Security benefits last year, and will be throughout the next decade under current law, contributing to the unified federal budget deficit and increasing federal debt held by the public. Looking at just the Social Security program, the total inflow, including payroll tax revenue and interest payments on the trust fund balances from the Treasury, will exceed the outflow from the combined old age survivors and disability insurance trust funds for the next several years. But that situation will reverse, and the outflow will exceed the inflow starting in 2017, CBO projects. That combination of trust funds includes the disability insurance trust fund, which will be exhausted in 2016.
I'm reading you a line about, so between now and 2023, we'll reach $1.3 trillion. That's a true statement.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lorenzen, we were talking, and I think this comes down to accurate measure, and you were ending your testimony about we need to, this is all about coming up with an accurate measure of inflation. And you didn't get a chance to finish, and I'd like to hear the rest of what you were going to say.
What I was saying is that the policy within the Social Security program, within the tax code, and many other programs is to ensure that the value of those benefits or those provisions in the tax code keep pace with inflation. And that as long as that is the policy, we should try to implement that policy in the most accurate way and make sure that those programs are indexed to the most accurate measure of inflation as possible. In some cases, providing a higher than justified increase in inflation masks other shortcomings in the programs or provides benefits across the board that benefit certain populations more so, and that providing a more accurate measure may have other undesirable consequences, but that those should be addressed by policies that are intended to do that. We shouldn't be having a policy to index programs to greater than inflation that provides a higher adjustment for everyone in order to help some. For example, it makes no sense to have a indexing of the tax code that provides a $450 windfall to someone at the top quintile of the tax code in order to protect a $25 tax benefit for some at the bottom quintile. It'd be far better to accurately index inflation for everyone, and then if we're concerned, as I am about the person at the bottom quintile, find another change in the tax code to address that. And I think we can do that in Social Security and other programs, of index the programs to achieve the policy goal of keeping inflation for all of them, and then finding ways to help and assist those for whom that change in inflation exposes other shortcomings.
What do you believe is the most accurate measure of inflation?
I do believe that the change CPI that has been developed over years is the most accurate measure based off of what I've read from economists and experts from across the ideological spectrum.
All right, thank you. CPE, Commissioner Grosjean, why is CPIE referred to as experimental, and is it ready for prime time?
The short answer is no, it's not ready for prime time, which is why we call it experimental. The problems with it are that it's based on a small sample size, but even more than that, it's based on using the same stores and the same prices and the same set of goods as for the general population. For the BLS to stand behind it as an official statistic, we would need to do the research involved to really design the program to measure the cost of living for the elderly in a statistically sound way.
Mr. Lorenzen, do you have any comments about the flaws in CPE?
I would add a couple of flaws. I think that healthcare is one area of different expenditures, but there are other differences in spending patterns among seniors that are not reflected in CPIE, including mail order and senior discounts. There's also questions about whether how it accounts for housing is accurate, that seniors are much more likely to own their own home and have a paid off mortgage, whereas and CPI and CPIE both assume that inflation based on imputed rent. On the issue of health care, I would say that two things. First, as was noted, it's not clear how much that the measures are accurate in measuring health inflation, that it's very difficult to do so accurately, and there are some suggestions that the measures overstate health care inflation. But also, I would add that the bulk of the average higher increase in healthcare costs for seniors is on a small population. And instead of, again, having a higher inflation adjustment based off of the higher health expenditures for that smallest population, we can address that through something like an out-of-pocket limit and other reforms of the Medicare program, instead of, again, providing a higher adjustment for everyone.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Swartz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the testimony. I do also have to start with where I think our premise has to begin, and I will echo some of the comments made by the ranking member that we should begin by understanding that Social Security is different and is funded differently, has its own trust fund. And in fact, in the wisdom of Congress, they actually anticipated the baby boomers, unlike the in Medicare, for example, and that was important. So there are dollars in Social Security going forward, and that we've made a commitment, and that Social Security to seniors and to their families, and that we ought to start with the premise of absolutely sustaining it and making sure it's there for our current seniors and our future seniors, and the discussion about how to modify the CPI, Consumer Price Index, for Social Security, it feels really different. You know, and really how it affects seniors who, as I think was pointed out on the panel for all of you, is that the idea of changing it, and then already we know it's not going to work for all seniors, so therefore how many seniors are we then going to modify it for, because we're worried about older seniors, the biggest group that's growing, over 85, the poorest seniors, which is a whole lot of them also, and our sickest seniors. So if you're starting to sort of say, okay, it doesn't work for this percent or that percent or that percent, are you beginning to say, is this a wise thing to do? And that's really the question before us. Should we even be applying a change in the change CPI, or even considering it for seniors and for Social Security? That's a big deal. In Pennsylvania, it's a big deal. We have almost 2 million seniors. And as you know, seniors are aging. And it was already pointed out, they have very different they have different use of the economy than you might compare to a 25 or 35 or 45-year-old. They are living on fixed incomes, right? More and more of them are relying on Social Security as the one piece that they know is going to come to them. Small changes in an inflationary factor. I think this becomes increasingly important as we're seeing changes in retirement benefits for many Americans. The sort of move from defined benefits to defined contributions. It may be even more important as we go forward for future seniors. And again, you point out that most seniors live on, I thought the number was 14,000 average income. You'd said it was 17,000. It's still not very much. So I wanted to really ask the question about, particularly about how this would apply to the poorest and sickest seniors. And the question was raised about seniors have a real different position in terms of health care than younger Americans. I know when I talk to a group of seniors, and I bet if I said it to everybody in this room, how many of you take a medication? Forget the ones who are really serious, but how many of you who are over 65 take a medication? If I talk to a senior center, they laugh. I said, does anyone take one? They all laugh at me. One? What are you talking about? One? How about two? How about three? How about four? And which one are you not going to take if you don't get a little more of an increase? So it's a little different than am I going to buy steak or chicken? It's really a question, am I going to buy chicken at all? Or am I going to buy vegetables? Am I going to take one medication versus another? And that's serious business, because does it have implications for higher costs for families, who often have to help out their seniors, relatives, or higher cost to taxpayers because they show up in emergency rooms, or they have to use up costs in other ways. So the implication in relationship to healthcare costs, which seem to be very, very important and different for seniors, as well as some of the issues some others may want to raise about housing. But these are seniors who live on a fixed income. It's not easy for them to shift costs to somewhere else. I mean, and some do. I'll get a job. I'll get a second job. I'll find a higher paying job. I won't buy a new car this year. This is really not what most 85-year-olds or 80-year-olds or even 75-year-olds are really thinking about. So we really have to understand that this may be very different than a change we might make or might not make in how we index increases otherwise. I'll ask the question because but I will say that the other thing we hear as members of Congress all the time is that the increases, and they're small, that they get in Social Security often go to the increases in Medicare cost sharing. And they get pretty upset about it. So it's not even an increased question about whether they can afford increases in their heating bill. That really comes down to them because they've already had to use it all up for health care. So I really wanted to ask Ms. Altman if you could just speak more specifically to how many seniors would have to already be, I think Mr. Lorenzen talked about this, would have to be, it would have to be ameliorated. The harm to seniors, it would have to be ameliorated in terms of, again, our sickest seniors, our poorest seniors, our oldest seniors.
Yeah, we've actually looked at that very carefully, and it's really more than half. I mean, if you're talking about the poorest of the poor, you're talking about 8.4 million seniors who are not getting SSI, but just Social Security, but are poor or near poor. As you say, the population is aging, so the more and more are getting older, and and as I say, the amelioration, if it's an accurate index, you don't have to ameliorate, so that it's, people talk about shielding veterans. 2 out of 5 Social Security beneficiaries are veterans. So there are lots of groups that I think the American people would see as deserving and not worthy of having a cut, and this would,
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Kelly, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here. There's an old adage where I come from, and it goes, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. But in this case, we do know where we're going. And we know that if we don't take a look into the future, and we don't get this fixed. Now, I understand charts, and I understand that there's, income has nothing to do with solvency. There's a lot of people make a lot of money and still go broke every year. So it's not a matter of how much you make, it's how much you save. It's about keeping your spending under control. And if we really, and we all, listen, there's not a person in here, I'm 64. You think I'm not concerned about what's happening? I'm absolutely concerned what's happening. But by the same token, there's something about early detection. If you get it early enough, you can usually get it fixed and get it done at a much less cost. So I'm trying to figure out why are we even having the hearing today if there's no problem. We get all kind of revenue. We don't have any problem looking into the future. And why are we worrying about this? Why are we even having this conversation about the solvency and the long-range stability of Social Security? Because if I look at the figures, what are we talking about? Got all kind of money. Got all kind of money coming in. Economy's in a rebound. It's growing at just a tremendous rate, 1.6, 1.8. But here's the deal. Here's the deal. If your heart's as willing as it is, but your wallet's weak, I don't care how much you care about these folks. I care about them. And we make promises to people years ago that we can't keep today, and then we try to soft soap it. And really, I wish policy were the driving force in this town and not politics. I wish we could talk about the reality of how we're going to save this program as opposed to how we're going to spin it some way that makes us look good in the next election. If we really care about Americans, and I don't care if Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, whatever you are in this country, there is always that ability to speak about it openly and do it the right way, but do it honestly, please. I want to save the program too. Mr. Blahash, you have some interesting approaches to this because I really look at it. Running a business all my life, there's a lot of things that I made a mistake on early. My dad was a World War II pilot, and much like the chairman, he was a bomber pilot, and we had a Cessna franchise for a while. And the most important thing he told me is when we were flying somewhere, he would say, son, make sure that you chart that the right way and make sure that you stay on course. Now, it's no big deal being off 1 degree. If you're only flying, I grew up in a little town called Butler, about 25 miles from Pittsburgh. You can be off 1 degree flying from Butler to Pittsburgh and end up pretty close to Pittsburgh. But if we were flying from Butler to Los Angeles, well, I could end up in Oregon. So there's a long range effect to this stuff. So the equities that you talked about, I mean, if it's not a problem, if we have all this income, if it's coming in and we can't spend it fast enough and don't worry about it, why be concerned? Why all the interest? And if we don't do this, what's the ultimate effect? And I like the approach you have to it because we're talking now about numbers that support what our hearts want to do.
Well, I think even relative to many other experts, I'm extremely concerned about the financial future of Social Security. You made a reference to early detection, and I fear that the early detection light has been going off for a while, and there's been a failure to act. And I fear that we are actually getting to the point where it is going to be forbiddingly difficult to get this problem resolved. In 1983, the program faced a very substantial financing crisis, and it took a tremendous amount of bipartisan cooperation to resolve it. You actually had Republicans and Democrats joining together to overcome the very spirited opposition of the AARP and other seniors groups. It was a very difficult thing to do. They had to delay COLAs by 6 months. They had to raise the retirement age. They had to expose benefits to taxation for the first time. They had to bring all federal employees into the system. They had to accelerate a previously enacted increase in the payroll tax. So this was really politically painful stuff. The current long-range shortfall in Social Security, relative to that then, it's about twice as large now. So the amount of political pain that all of you would have to endure in a long-range solvency fix is about twice as much as it was in '83. If you did it 50-50 on benefits and taxes, conservatives would have to agree to twice as much in terms of tax increases and progressives at twice as much in terms of benefit restraints as was done in 1983. That's a very tall order. And with each passing year, this becomes a bigger problem to solve. So I am very worried about it. I'm worried about the consequences if we don't enact repairs relatively soon.
Okay, I think, Mr. Renese and I are both automobile dealers. In the old days, we had gauges that told us what the coolant temperature was, what the oil pressure was, and they switched the lights. And they'd go red, and it was called idiot lights because the problem with when the light was on, it was already too late. The engine was fried. So you say we have a blinking light right now? It may be blinking yellow, but we better wake up and smell the coffee. We're at a dangerous, dangerous point, and I thank you for your testimony. And Mr. Chairman, my time has expired.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson, you're recognized for 5
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. And I'm glad you preceded me in the questioning because you raised an issue that I came into this committee thinking about today. It's a little bit confusing as we deal with this. I think we need to talk about chain CPI and what it means and how it works. But the idea that we're talking about it from the advantage that you brought up as part of the shortfall for the Social Security, I find a little bit baffling, and I don't think it's a reform to Social Security. As I understand it, it's about 20% of the shortfall, and that's a long way from what we need to be doing. And it's even worse in this case because to get that 20% of the shortfall, you're cutting benefits to seniors. And you're cutting benefits to veterans, and many times that those veterans are the seniors that we're trying to help provide a secure retirement. And then also when we talk about chain CPI as part of the deficit issue, I think it really muddies the water because Social Security doesn't have anything to do with the debt as I understand it. I don't believe Social Security has added a dime to our debt, and I don't believe it can by law. So when you start commingling these topics, I don't know if it gets us to where we need to be. And that is, we certainly need to deal with our deficit. We need a long-term plan to do it. And when we start doing that, I think we need to look at what caused it. And you can't have major tax cuts without paying for them. You can't go to war without paying for it. You can't provide prescription drug benefits without paying for it. And yet we're not talking about anything like that. We also need to make sure that Social Security is available for providing a secure retirement for many years to come. And as I mentioned, this doesn't do it. It's 20%, and I don't know how you factor that in. If you look at the 20%, and you're getting that from the seniors themselves, that kind of raises havoc with the security of those seniors that you're trying to help. But I have a couple of specific questions. Ms. Altman, can you explain how chain CPI cuts veterans' benefits?
Sure. The veterans' benefits actually can get hit 2 or 3 or 4 times because there are, as you know, there are a number of programs government-wide that are indexed. The largest savings comes from Social Security, and as I said earlier, 2 out of 5 veterans receive Social Security. People who are disabled or die in service in Iraq or Afghanistan qualify for Social Security benefits. So those benefits would be cut by the chain CPI. In addition, there are a number of veteran-specific programs, veteran retirement programs and programs for disabled veterans. Those also are indexed, and those also would be cut by the chain CPI.
So if you're a veteran who was wounded in a previous war and you get a certain disability payment as a result of that, you can expect to see your veteran's disability check reduced.
That's right.
And if you're a veteran who was killed and your children are receiving benefits, you can expect, you can't, but that the children of that veteran can expect to see a reduction in their benefits that they receive from their dead mother or father.
And in fact, they'll be cut twice because they also receive survivors' benefits under Social Security.
Mr. Bayless, do you still believe we ought to privatize Social Security?
Well, as you know, I worked for President Bush and worked on his proposal to include personal accounts in Social Security. I actually think that though at one time it would have been prudent to try to save as much Social Security contributions as we could going forward in personal accounts, I think that time has passed. I think it's too late to advance fund a significant portion of Social Security obligations, and I believe our solutions are, at this point, best confined to the traditional ones of just trying to align benefits and taxes within the
So
current
you
structure.
don't believe we should privatize Social Security?
No.
And how do you think we should do the reform?
Well, I think I'll give you a two-part answer. I mean, there's what I personally would design if I were dictator of the world, and there's what I would support. The second range is much wider than the first one. I would tend to focus primarily on reductions in the rate of growth on the high-income end, basically by changing the benefit formula. There's some other changes I would make.
Is that you would mean test it?
Well, no, I wouldn't do a true means test, because a means test basically means measuring income outside of the Social Security system and withholding benefits based on that. But there's a benefit formula in the current law that is progressive. Basically, it's like a system of income tax brackets, except you have benefit brackets. And I would basically make those more progressive and hold down benefit growth on the higher income end. Having said that, there have been proposals put forward that would do more of a mix of revenue changes and benefit changes, like the Simpson-Bowles proposal.
Raising the age, is that one of the?
Raising the age would be something I would consider, as
Bumping
was
the
in
tax
Simpson-Bowles. And
level?
Simpson-Bowles included some increases in the tax base as well. I frankly think a solution is important enough that I'd go along with a variety of ways to do it.
Gentleman's time has expired. There are a lot of ways to fix it, and we need to, and we will. Mr. Griffin, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start out by saying that I saw a representative from the White House here in the room, and I want to say something I don't say much, which is I congratulate the President on acknowledging that we have a problem. There are some people here I've heard from today that don't acknowledge that we have a problem, and the President has acknowledged that we have a problem. We may disagree on what to do about it, but it was welcome to see him at least putting something forward that starts the conversation on this. I will say that one of the big problems is the longer we wait, the closer we get to the edge of the cliff, the fewer options we have. And we've heard sort of a reference to that here a minute ago. My mother's on Social Security. I pay into Social Security, despite what the internet says, and hope to get Social Security benefits at some point. I am, especially since I turned down my congressional pension. So I am counting on Social Security. I want to save it, but I feel like that I'm in a land of glitter and unicorns here, because you've got people who are saying that Social Security has a problem, it doesn't have enough money, but it doesn't add to the deficit or the debt. Complete and utter nonsense. And I'm not going to be one of these guys that cites factcheck.org, although they've commented on this. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. But the bottom line is we have a yearly deficit. If Social Security only used the money it has, we would have a problem. You can say it doesn't add to the deficit, you can say it doesn't add to the debt, but you may be thinking of Social Security as a separate fund, and it technically is, but it's one government.
Would gentleman yield?
The gentleman will not yield. If you take $100 in your personal account and separate it in 10 separate accounts, you still got $100. The bottom line is, because of where we go to get the money to plus up Social Security, at the end of the day, we're borrowing money. Where is the money coming from if we're not borrowing it from somewhere? You know, I mean, this is just ridiculous. And I agree with this gentleman. Why are we here if there's not a problem? There is a problem. And that's why we're here. It's that simple. Now, you can talk Washington speak about moving money around and it's not here and it's not adding to the debt. That's a bunch of nonsense to normal people. You're insulting people when you say that we have enough money. And if you say we don't have enough money, then you got to admit that it's adding to some deficit somewhere, even if it's on another balance sheet. These ideas of trust funds are Washington speak because we know that they are routinely treated as one big pool of money. So either you're wasting my time, which I rushed over here from somewhere else, or we have a problem. I think the president just acknowledged we have a problem. And the idea that anybody, I'm a veteran, I'm still serving. I had to get up early this morning and run Army Reserve all the way down the mall. So don't talk to me about veterans. My grandfather served in World War I. I served in Iraq. I want to help veterans. But will they be better off if we have a debt crisis, folks? How are seniors going to be better if we have a debt crisis? Ask the Europeans. It's a bunch of nonsense. I had a question, but I'm out of time. And I tell you, if I hear somebody else say that we got plenty of money and this is not adding to the deficit and debt, I just can't listen to it. So I thank President Obama for starting the conversation so we can fix this for the next generation of people, which includes me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The president is aware. Mr. Doggett, you're recognized.
Well, let me just affirm that Social Security is not adding to the debt to begin with. But that doesn't mean that I'm not concerned about the long-term solvency of Social Security and that it will be there as strong for my grandchildren as it was for my parents. Mr. Lawrenson, your group has worked with the recommendations of the Simpson-Bowles Commission, and this is not the only recommendation that the Simpson-Bowles Commission made to assure the long-term solvency of Social Security, is it?
No, it is not.
And in fact, one of the other recommendations of the Simpson-Bowles Commission was that the wage base and the taxable wage base would be slowly expanded. And did not that proposal, if the concern is for the solvency, the long-term solvency of Social Security, didn't that proposal do more to protect the long-term solvency than adjusting the cost of living increase?
It did do somewhat more in the balance.
Okay.
The fiscal commission plan was a comprehensive plan that looked at all parts on
and I
revenues
guess
and spending.
I want to be open to all points of view. My main objection here when the president's name is invoked is that once again, as has happened a number of other times in this administration, he begins by saying he agrees with what the Republicans want, which is clearly a limitation on the growth of Social Security benefits, and then begs for something in return. And of course, they have rejected any other revenues, including additional revenues to protect the solvency of Social Security, or closing corporate loopholes, or making the other changes that would allow us to address our budget shortfall, which is very real. Commissioner, let me ask you, with reference to the chain CPI, my understanding from your testimony is that even if the Republicans exerted total control on this and they could impose it this morning, we're not quite ready yet to do so. It's not, as you said, ready for prime time yet.
What's not ready for prime time is the chained CPIE.
Right.
The chained CPIU is ready.
Could be ready.
That's right. You have to deal with the fact that it's revised twice, but there is a plan out there that would allow that to happen.
You've indicated that implementing that will
it's official. Yeah.
Takes longer than the way we do the CPI now. That the data takes longer to collect and is not as available as quickly as the way we do it now.
No, we have we publish an initial number, and that could be used to adjust the cost of living were that the choice of the policymakers. The BLS makes no recommendation on how our official numbers should be used.
I guess, like so many other members, I received so many expressions of concern for seniors during the 2 years that they received no cost of living increase of any kind. And the notation that increases in the cost of food at the grocery store didn't decline or stay steady during that time, they soared. If we had, in effect, the cost of living increase that is being discussed today, the chained approach, how much less over the last decade or two would seniors have received? Would there have been other years in which they had no cost of living increase?
We can do that calculation for you. I don't have that off the top of my head. Mike's looking quickly, but I.
It wouldn't surprise you if over, taking it, say, over the last 2 decades, if they had 2 recent years in which they got no cost of living increase, if this new system had been in place, there would have been other years over that 20 years in which they also would have received no cost of living increase.
Possibly.
And Ms. Altman, let me ask you also, looking forward, with reference to veterans, and I appreciate the gentleman's service, but I've got a lot of veterans in the San Antonio, San Marcos, Austin area concerned about what impact this will have on them, just like seniors and individuals with disabilities. What difference will it make over time to them in terms of kind of dollars and cents? What's the estimate?
And let me make clear that the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign War are against the chained CPI, both for Social Security and the veterans programs. They would have the figures on the overall calculation. My focus is.
So you're saying both the VFW and the American Legion oppose this change?
And about 10 other, we can give you a list. The veterans, there are about 10 Paralyzed Veterans of America. There are a host, those are the most prominent groups, but there are about 10 veterans groups that have come out against it, and we can provide your staff with the letters they've sent.
Thank you.
Actually, I have an answer, yeah. The 2 years where there was no increase for 2009 and 2010, and actually the changed CPIU would have given a 0.3% increase rather than
during
zero during
Why
that
is
year.
that?
It's because, well, the substitution, basically the substitution effect. Right. Mike's gonna.
So one of the issues is that we had such a large increase in energy prices in 2008, and then the decline. The way that the adjustment in Social Security works using the CPIW is that it's compared to the previous peak. So we had 2 years where the index was not above the previous peak. However, with the chain, because of substitution, it started at a lower level and came back a little bit faster. So just in terms of the comparison of the previous year, it hit that previous peak 1 year earlier than with the way it's adjusted in the official way it's adjusted.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. T. Berry.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Doggett, can we sign you up for that proposal now?
Not quite there.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, man, if I were watching on C-SPAN 25 on the internet right now, I'd be pretty darn confused. And I got to tell you, I'm so blessed. I have an 80-year-old father, who's going to be 80 this year, who came to America in 1950. In 1950, there were 16.5 workers for every retiree on Social Security, and there weren't 10,000 people retiring a day. Now there's less than 3 workers for every retiree. So my dad's figured it out. My mom's figured it out. And by the way, my mom and dad, who still live in the same house that I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, just got rid of last year of their 18-year-old car, not because they wanted to, but because it broke down. And Social Security is still really, really important to them. But they look at their grandkids, and they've, again, figured it out, partly because of organizations like yours, who are doing a great job of saying, we got a problem, even though some honorable folks, even up here, believe there's not a problem. But here's what helped them.
But the gentleman, you just
after my 5 minutes, I will. Because
after your 5
well,
minutes.
he might. You know, he's determined.
I just wanted to say, I don't think, I never said there's not an issue or challenge for Social Security. I just said that today, using Social Security funds to pay for deficits that it didn't cause are the problem. But they're, certainly we all want to take care of Social Security long-term.
Well, not long-term for me is like very quickly approaching, because when I get my Social Security statement now, it says if we do nothing, if I go online, I will get approximately 72% of the benefits that I am supposed to get. I mean, that's, when I came in 2000, when I was elected in 2000, Mr. Becerra, it didn't say that. I used to talk about saving Social Security for my kids, and now it's for people of my generation. And my mom and dad get that, not because they're concerned about me, but they're really concerned about their grandkids. Because if it's going to impact me and my generation, God help my kids and their kids. So, sir, in your testimony, or in your written testimony, which I thought was awesome, you talk about the difference between the president's proposal and the current law, and the difference it has in terms of impact on benefits over a year, over a period of 20 years. Can you expand on that for us?
Well, I was speaking about just proposals on the change CPI.
Yes.
Generally, not the specifics of the president's proposal, but.
I'm sorry.
But having said that, that with change CPI in place, benefits will still be increasing in nominal terms, obviously.
Can you say that again? I can't quite hear you.
Sorry. Benefits will still
Thank
be
you.
increasing in actual terms. They'll be increasing slightly less than they are under scheduled law by doing it more accurately. However, the trust fund is projected to be exhausted in 2033, at which point there would be a 25% reduction for all beneficiaries. The change CPI would delay that exhaustion briefly and make the shortfall thereafter smaller. So benefits would be higher with change CPI because the trust fund still has money to pay benefits with that policy. But also because the initial benefits are indexed to wages, that a future retiree is going to start with a greater benefit in nominal term, in real inflation adjusted terms, than a previous retiree. So if you were to compare someone who was retired in 1993 at age 65 and what their benefit is today, and took a comparable worker and had them who retired today at age 65, 20 years from now, when they are 85, even if change CPI had been applied and there was not any bump up in benefits or any other adjustments to compensate for it, someone retiring today would still have a higher benefit in real inflation adjusted terms at age 85.
Thank you. Thank you. Commissioner, one last quick question. So to follow up on Mr. Doggett's point, so if this is enacted, long term, this isn't even enough, correct? We need to do more?
I'm sorry.
Because of demographics in terms of Social Security.
No, the BLS doesn't do calculations.
All right, Mr. Blayhouse.
You have to do a lot more.
We have to do a lot more. Any suggestions on your part in terms of saving for my kids, in terms of saving Social Security for them, at the same time not hurting current seniors like my mom and dad?
Well, I think we're sort of in all of the above mode.
Okay.
We have to make changes to the eligibility age. I think we have to make changes to the benefit formula. I think we should slow the rate of benefit growth on the high income end just by making brute force changes in the factors in the benefit formula itself. And I think there's other changes we should make to improve the work incentives in the system that would basically have the effect of rewarding seniors who stay in the workforce longer.
And the longer we wait, the more difficult a challenge it is?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And we got to get it through the House and Senate.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
May or may not happen. Mr. Becerra for a half a minute.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to make sure we're clear on something. We say we want to preserve Social Security. So this is about making sure for our kids and our grandkids it's working as well as it's worked for our parents and grandparents. But to try to make it sound like Social Security is having the sky fall on it today, when the sky is falling on the federal budget, which has exhausted its resources and overspent, not Social Security, to deny that the Social Security Trust Fund that Americans have created through their tax contributions doesn't exist, and that the interest it earned is like telling any American, how much money do you have in your pocket today? Well, can you pay off your house and your car loan today with the money you have in your pocket without going into your savings account? That's crazy. We have money in the savings account for Social Security, and it's there because Americans contributed taxpayer money into that fund. So to cut benefits, to discuss a budget deficit caused by unpaid for wars or tax cuts that went to very wealthy folks, that's just putting it on the backs of seniors. And so I think a number of us are ready to engage in a conversation about what we do long-term to make sure Social Security is viable for everyone. But to just cut seniors and veterans benefits to deal with today's budget deficits caused by other things, that's what concerns many of us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time.
Your president likes the idea. Thank you to our witnesses for their testimony. I also thank our members for being here, and we know that we've got to do something to protect Social Security long-term, and we will do that. Come 2033, Social Security won't be able to pay full benefits. Americans won't need and deserve a Social Security program they and their children and grandchildren can count on. And as our hearing series moves forward, I look to our continued examination of bipartisan Social Security reforms. We need to do right by today's beneficiaries and workers. When there is bipartisan agreement, we can and should act, and we will. And I want to thank you all for being here today. The meeting stands adjourned. Thank you.
Excuse me, sir. Can I shake his hand? Can I shake your
Oh,
hand?
God bless you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.